All right, so China's thinking about making a move, and it could really shake things up globally. We're talking devaluing their currency, the yuan. You sent this Benzinga article over, and it got us thinking, is this really going to work? What if it totally backfires?
It's a pretty risky move, especially with what they're dealing with. Economists are calling it a balance sheet recession. It's a lot like what happened in the Eurozone back in 2011. And then you've got Trump with his proposed tariffs,
Yeah.
just throwing more fuel on the fire.
Okay, so let's break this down. First things first, why is China even thinking about devaluing the yuan? I mean, they're not just hitting the discount button just for fun, right?
Well, devaluation would make Chinese goods cheaper on the global market,
Sure.
which is tempting when you're facing a potential 60% tariff on exports to the U.S. Think about the impact that would have on industries like electronics. Your next smartphone or laptop could all of a sudden be way more affordable.
Okay, yeah, I see how that would be appealing, at least on the surface. But the article mentions there are some serious risks, too. Like, this could be the start of a full-blown currency war
Exactly.
with countries trying to undercut each other.
Right.
And a weaker yuan might help with tariffs. But it's not going to solve the bigger problem, is it? That balance sheet recession?
No, it won't. Think of it like a company that has way too much debt. Even if their products are suddenly cheaper, they're still drowning
Yeah.
in debt.
And this isn't just some abstract economic theory either. The article says that China's housing market collapse wiped out trillions in household wealth. That's got to be weighing on people, no matter how cheap things get.
Oh, absolutely. This quote from Alfonso Pecatielli, the chief investing officer at Pal Neuro Capital, really sums it up. He says, during a balance sheet recession, people are more concerned with their declining wealth than with cheaper goods. They're just trying to survive, focused on paying down debt, not buying a bunch of stuff just because it's on sale.
So if a weaker yuan isn't the answer, what is? Does this Pecatiello guy have any other ideas?
He does, and it's a pretty bold one. He suggests targeted fiscal stimulus, specifically aimed at businesses and consumers who are struggling the most. It's like throwing them a life raft, trying to keep them afloat.
But would China actually go for something that big? The article mentions they've tried smaller things, like interest rate cuts
Yeah.
and discouraging short selling.
Yeah, but the results haven't been that great. Take a look at the iShares MSCI China ETF. That tracks Chinese equities. It's still down almost 50% from its peak in 2021. The markets are clearly nervous about whether China has this under control.
So we've got this possible currency devaluation, a balance sheet recession looming, and an expert suggesting some pretty serious intervention. What does all this mean for someone like me, someone who's not an economist, but wants to understand how this might affect their life?
That's the question, isn't it? What happens in China doesn't stay in China. Their economy is so tied to the rest of the world that any big problems they have will affect everyone.
Okay, so help me understand. What are some of the ripple effects we might see?
Let's start with the devaluation. If they actually do it. Sure, we might see cheaper prices on some things, some imported goods, in the short term. But in the long run, it could start a global currency war, leading to instability and unpredictable market swings.
And what about this balance sheet recession? Could that have global implications too?
Absolutely. A weaker Chinese economy means less demand for goods and services from other countries. That could easily trigger a slowdown or even a recession in other parts of the world.
So this is definitely something we should all be paying attention to. But it's complicated. What are the most important things our listeners should keep in mind as we learn more about this?
I think the key takeaway here is China's at a crossroads. The decisions they make in the coming weeks and months will have huge consequences, not just for them, but for all of us.
And it sounds like there are no easy answers. Tweaking interest rates or offering small-scale stimulus packages isn't going to magically fix a balance sheet recession this big.
Exactly. We need to look beyond the headlines and understand how complex this situation really is.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have different perspectives, like the ones in the Benzinga article.
Yeah.
But those are so important, as we were talking about. China's response to all of this,
Yeah.
it kind of feels like a high-stakes poker game.
Oh, I like that. Who are the players and what are the stakes?
Well, you've got China and the U.S. as the main players, each one trying to outmaneuver the other. With these big economic moves, China might devalue the yuan to counter those tariffs Trump is proposing.
And the U.S. is just watching, trying to figure out what China's going to do next and how to respond without making things worse.
Exactly. And the stakes are huge. If either side makes a mistake, it could start a trade war, possibly even leading to a global recession.
Yeah.
Not to mention the political and social instability, that usually comes with economic hardship.
Yeah, this is getting intense. But before we get too lost in all the geopolitics, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, the human impact of all of this.
That's important. We can't forget about the real people. Whose lives are being affected by this?
Yeah, we're talking about families in China who might be struggling because of the housing market crash.
Exactly. Imagine a family that put all their savings into buying an apartment, hoping it would secure their future. And then the market crashes. Their nest egg is suddenly worth way less than what they paid for it. They're stuck with a huge debt and a depreciating asset.
It's got to feel like they're trapped with their future hanging in the balance.
Then that feeling, that anxiety, it spreads. They might have to cut back on spending, which hurts local businesses. Maybe they put off having kids or delay their kids' college plans. These are the real consequences of a balance sheet recession.
It's really sad, especially when you think about millions of families across China going through the same thing. But this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's a bigger picture here. We need to look at the historical context.
You're right. China's economy has transformed over the past few decades. They've gone from an agricultural society to a global economic powerhouse in a really short amount of time. But that rapid growth came at a cost.
Yeah, they took on a lot of debt to fuel that expansion. And now that debt has become a problem.
It's like they hit a speed bump on their way to becoming the world's biggest economy.
The big question is, can they adjust and keep growing? Or will this force them to rethink their goals? You know, I want to shift gears a little and talk about the U.S. How do you think they'll react if China devalues the yuan?
Well, I doubt they'll be happy about it. The tariffs were meant to protect American businesses and workers from what they see as unfair competition from China. A weaker yuan would just make Chinese imports even cheaper and undermine that whole goal.
So it could be seen as a challenge to the U.S., which could escalate tensions even more.
It's possible. It could be seen as a provocation, leading to countermeasures, trade wars, maybe even something worse. And we can't forget about this situation in Ukraine and the tension between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, so this is adding another layer of complexity to an already unstable situation. Listening to you, I'm struck by how connected everything is.
Absolutely. We live in a globalized world. What happens in one country affects everyone. This whole thing with China in the yuan is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we can't just ignore what's happening in other parts of the world. We need to stay informed.
I agree. And that brings us back to the question we asked earlier. If you were advising the Chinese government, what would you tell them to do about this balance sheet recession? Have you had any more thoughts about that?
I have, and it's a tough one. There are so many things to think about, and it seems like every solution has downsides. But I think it's important to try to put ourselves in their shoes and think through these issues, even if we don't have all the answers.
Yeah, it's about thinking critically, understanding the trade-offs. So let's imagine we're sitting with China's top economic advisors. What are some things you would bring up?
I think I'd start by saying it's important to focus on the root of the problem, the balance sheet recession. This isn't just about encouraging people to spend more. It's about helping people and businesses fix their finances. It's about restoring confidence.
So you're thinking about that targeted fiscal stimulus that Piketty suggested, giving money to those who were hurt most by the housing market crash, helping struggling businesses.
Yeah, it seems like the most logical approach. The alternative, doing nothing, or just doing small things, could make things even worse in the long run. A balance sheet recession that drags on could cripple the Chinese economy and have a ripple effect on the global economy.
It's like treating a serious illness. Sometimes you need strong medicine, even if it has side effects, to fix the underlying problem.
But wouldn't that be super expensive for the government? And wouldn't it potentially distort the market and give an unfair advantage to some companies?
Those are good points. But given how big the problem is, and the potential consequences of doing nothing, the Chinese government might say, that the benefits of intervention outweigh the risks, they might prioritize economic stability and social well-being over strict free market principles.
I see your point, but we can't forget about the potential devaluation of the yuan. What would you tell them to do about that?
That's the big question. Devaluing the yuan could help boost exports in the short term and help offset those tariffs. But it could also trigger a currency war, which could destabilize the global financial system and hurt China's reputation as a responsible economic power.
So they're walking a tightrope. How do you think they should handle this?
I think they need to be careful and communicate clearly. If they decide to devalue the yuan, they should do it gradually and be transparent about it to minimize the risk of retaliation and market panic. They need to explain their intentions to the U.S. and other trading partners
Right.
to avoid misunderstandings and accusations of manipulation.
Yeah, it's about finding a balance between protecting their own interests and maintaining stability in the global system.
Yeah.
It sounds almost impossible.
It is a tough situation. They're dealing with these economic problems at home while trying to become a major player on the world stage. It's a delicate balancing act with potential problems at every turn.
So we've been talking about China's economy, but I'm curious, how does all of this fit into the bigger picture?
That's a great question. It's easy to focus on the crisis in hand, but we also need to think about the long-term trends shaping the world. We're living in a time of rapid technological change, shifting global power dynamics, and a growing gap between the rich and poor. So where does China fit into all of this?
Well, they're definitely not falling behind in technology. The article talks about how China is investing heavily in things like AI and robotics. It seems like they're going head-to-head with the U.S. for technological dominance.
And that rivalry has implications that go way beyond just who has the fastest computer chip or the best algorithm. It affects everything: global trade, investment flows, national security, even cultural influence.
It's almost like a new Cold War, where economic and technological power are the main weapons.
That's an interesting way to look at it. And it's not just about competing with the U.S. China's also trying to increase its influence around the world. Think about the Belt and Road Initiative. Their plan to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure projects.
That's a huge project. It could completely change global trade routes and economic alliances. Some people are calling it a modern-day Silk Road, with China at the center.
It definitely shows that they're thinking long-term about global leadership. They're not just reacting to short-term problems. They're facing economic challenges at home. But at the same time, they're trying to become a major force on the world stage.
That's pretty interesting. They're dealing with problems in their own backyard, but they're also trying to run a marathon. How do other countries feel about this, about China's rise?
It depends. Some see China as a good economic partner, a source of investment and growth. Others are more suspicious. They see China as a potential rival or even a threat to their own economic and political interests. There are concerns about China's human rights record, their approach to intellectual property, and their increasingly assertive foreign policy.
So it seems like the world is trying to figure out how to deal with China. They want to cooperate.
Right.
But they're also being cautious.
Exactly. And this economic situation just makes things even more complicated. Will China's problems force them to focus more on domestic issues? Or will they double down on their global ambitions? Will they see economic expansion as a way to maintain control and influence?
Those are some big questions, and I don't think anyone knows the answers for sure, but that's what makes this so fascinating. We're not just talking about abstract theories here. We're talking about a story that's still unfolding, with real consequences for everyone.
And that's why it's so important to engage with these issues, to think critically about the information we're getting, and to question our own assumptions. There are always multiple perspectives, and no one has all the answers.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. It reminds me that we can't just sit back and watch what's happening in the world. We need to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking tough questions.
I couldn't agree more. And remember, the learning never stops. There's always more to explore, more perspectives to consider, more connections to make. Stay curious, keep digging, and let's keep trying to understand this complex world together.
Well said. That's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more explorations of the forces shaping our world.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those great articles coming.